Hi BookTube, it's Amy. I'm here for my Friday reads and I'm actually filming it on the Friday for once. I've been up for about an hour and I thought I would sit down and film this before I sit around and read all day. So this past week I finished reading J.M. Barrie's collection of articles, The Greenwood Hat. So this is something that he published privately in a limited number of editions in the 1930s. And essentially what he did, he distributed that edition to friends, but he took a look back at some of the articles that he published anonymously between 1885 and 1887. So when he was first, kicking off his writing career, getting settled, trying to make a lot of money to survive, he did a lot of anonymous writing, and he would sort of spit out all these articles and pretend to be, different people from different perspectives. And so he would write as from the perspective as someone's mother, or he would write as a child, or he would write as someone from some small little town somewhere. And in here, it's quite funny because at one point he decided to write as his own critic, as someone who was criticizing him. And I did film a short video about that essay earlier this week, as well as another chapter in here called The Blue and White Room, where he took it was his sister's house, a particular room that she had curated in all blue and white. He took that notion and spun it into a chapter, a short article / essay about this woman who is absolutely obsessed with keeping this blue and white room completely blue and white. So that was quite enjoyable as well. And there was an essay in here also about writing a biography of, I think it was George Meredith. That sounds about right. Just flipping through to make sure. Yes, a biography at Bay, Meredith. He writes from the perspective of a biographer who has been, granted permission to write a biography of Meredith. But Meredith has said that he doesn't want it published until he's dead. And so the biographer, has this finished biography, and he's in this awkward position of waiting for his friend Meredith to die. And of course, Meredith starts dodging him, not really interested in spending time with this old friend who is now waiting for him to die so he can make his fortune. And it's quite humorous in that regard. And I believe Barrie actually did know Meredith and may have actually written some biographical material on him. So this was a delightful book. The original articles along with commentary that Barrie wrote in the 1930s. And of course, this was distributed in a limited number of editions to his friends. And then after his death, it was published widely. And of course, I've got one of those wider editions. Who even knows what edition this is? I have no idea. Certainly not anything worth much of anything. This is the second impression from November of 1937. Okay, yeah, so that makes sense. There were 50 copies privately printed in 1930. It was reset and first published in November of 37. And this is the second impression from November of 37. So let's call that a third edition technically. But I'm still reading some more J.M. Barrie, and I've been reading some of the plays of J.M. Barrie as well. I had read several weeks back, I started off with Peter Pan, which is the first play in this collection. But then earlier this week, I read Quality Street, which is a amusing little play about two sisters who one of them's a bit older. It's hard to tell just how old. And the younger sister, who I guess is 20 when the play opens. Phoebe is the younger sister. And she has fallen in love with Mr. Valentine. And she, at the opening of the play, expects that Valentine is going to propose to her, but instead he comes by and sort of treats them like almost like two maiden aunts he would visit, and announces that he is enlisted and is going off to fight in the war. And this would have been the Napoleonic Wars. And so off he goes. Phoebe is heartbroken, and she takes on the cap of an old maid, and she and her sister become school teachers. They set up a school in their home because not only has he left, but because of a bad investment that they made based on his advice, they lost a good deal of their income, forcing them to work. And actually, this is interesting because that blue and white room that Barry wrote about in the Greenwood Hat, that he based on the room of his sister, makes an appearance as a room in this play. And Valentine is, sort of pining for that room as he's off in the war. And he comes back 10 whole years later. So Phoebe is now 30, and she looks far beyond her years. Her sister Susan is looking quite old herself. Valentine comes back. He's had fond memories of his time spent at Quality Street in this room. He's sort of come to the conclusion, I actually was in love with that woman, Phoebe. Maybe I'll go back and find her. And he comes back and finds them in reduced circumstances and finds her an old maid. Now, Phoebe is, quite heartbroken over this. And for reasons that only she can unravel for us, she decides to pretend to be her own niece. She dresses young again, pulls down her ringlets, and goes out in a ball gown to this party. And Valentine is completely, he's completely drawn into her act, and he really believes that she is not Phoebe, that she is this niece come from out of town. And so he starts going around with the niece. All the ladies in the town are a little bit confused because they understood that there was no niece in existence, because they don't have a niece. They have several nephews, but no niece. And Phoebe is still very much in love with him, and there is the danger, of course, that Valentine may fall in love with Phoebe, who is pretending to be this niece. And it is quite a delightful play. But then I read the next one in this collection, which was even better, and that is the Admiral Crichton. So it's this fun little story that almost reminds me a bit of like Swiss Family Robinson or something, that sort of scenario, shipwrecked on an island. And I would say Gilligan's Island, but of course that didn't exist when Barry was writing this play. But essentially it's about this wealthy family, and the patriarch of the family thinks they need to sort of learn to do for themselves and perhaps get a bit back to nature. And so he tells his wife and daughters that they can only bring one maid between the three of them on this boat trip they are taking. And of course, all the maids, for class reasons, quit because it's beneath them to, be a maid to three women at once. They would rather leave their position and find something more suitable, because in the social scale, they feel that they're above waiting on three women at once. So you have this kitchen maid who is promoted to, ladies' maid, and off she goes on this trip with them. But then you also have the butler of one of the gentlemen who also goes on this trip. And so you have several of the ladies. You have the ladies' maid, you have the butler, and you have the man of the house. And they go off on this trip, and they are shipwrecked on a deserted island far from any shipping lanes, where they spend several years in a sort of experiment. Now, the butler, Crichton, is an interesting character. So when they are in England, he is, horrified at the fact that any of the servants should be treated as equal to the master. In fact, he wants his master to be very high and mighty, and to be rude with him, to be short with him, because that is the way that the natural social order should be. He has this belief that there are always going to be power relations, and that in England, this is the way things are, this is the way of nature, this is the way they should be. He needs to maintain his role as a butler, as a servant, and his master needs to maintain the role as master, and those two sides should never mix, which is why Crichton is quite horrified when, in the opening scene of the play, they are hosting a monthly tea for the servants, where the servants all come up and have tea and are served by the wealthy family. But Crichton's beliefs are a lot more complex than you would think, because when they're shipwrecked on the island, all rules are gone. The power dynamics of nature have changed. Crichton is the one who knows how to start a fire. Crichton is the one who knows how to hunt, how to build shelters. He is the one who now believes that by the rights of nature, he should be the master. And indeed, he does become the master, and his old masters and the ladies are waiting on him. They refer to him as, captain, sir, and he is being waited on hand and foot, and they build this gigantic manor, and I'll leave it there. I won't spoil the ending for you, but it's certainly an interesting and funny play about power dynamics and about debates about the state of nature. And then I read the next one in this collection, Alice Sit by the Fire. I didn't enjoy this one quite as much. It's about a young woman, Amy, whose mother and father have been off in India, and she, who has almost come of age as a young woman, has been left alone with her brother and with some servants and a nurse who looks after the baby. And Amy has essentially become mistress of the house. She is painting furniture and sewing curtains and picking up one project after another. And she has furnished this entire house. It is her house. She possesses the keys, but she still has the characteristics of a teenager, of a child. She is keeping a diary. She and her friend are sneaking off to these, melodramatic plays with these absurd plots about women cheating on their husbands and being discovered in the rooms of those men, or otherwise, rejecting those men and returning to their husband. And Amy's head is quite turned by the content of these plays, and she has this very distorted perception of the world. And she hadn't seen her parents for over a year. She and her brother don't really recall much what they're like, and so she invents personalities for them based on her understanding of the world through these plays. And indeed, when the parents return, the baby is screaming, doesn't recognize the mother, doesn't want to be held by the mother. The son doesn't want to be kissed by the father. He's willing to hug the mother, but he's, very upright. Would you like some tea, as a host would be? And he's got this line prepared about going to read the paper. And Amy herself wants to throw herself into her mother's arms, but the mother has already been off-put by meeting her two other children, that she is, cold and formal with her daughter. And so you have this strained family relationship, but then Amy sees that her mother is perhaps a little bit too close to a family friend of theirs. And so off Amy goes to confront this man and confront her mother about the affair that she perceives them to be having. And I just didn't appreciate, the scene very much, where she is hiding in the cupboard of this strange man and, confronting her mother and how her mother sort of humors her. And it was just not a plot that I enjoyed. But then we have next in here the play What Every Woman Knows. And I quite enjoyed this one. In fact, it almost reminded me a bit, obviously this is J.M. Barrie, but it reminded me a bit of how Anthony Trollope often wrote about politics and the relationships of people involved with politics. So you have these semi-wealthy men, the father and the brothers, and they have their sort of maiden sister slash daughter. And she is 27, 28, definitely on her way to being an old maid. Her name is Maggie, and she is hoping that this gentleman is going to ask for her hand in marriage. But in the opening scene of the play, we see that he has asked somebody else much younger than her and much prettier. And the men in her family are spoiling her with gifts, saying that, any day now she'll have an offer of marriage. And then they discover that someone has been breaking into their house, breaking into their library. And they confront him, and they realize it is a young man from the village who is breaking in every night to read their books. He has run out of money to go to school. He is using their library, and they make a deal with him. They make a deal with John that they will pay for him to go and finish his education. They will pay for him to sort of progress in politics to start. And in return, they will not call the police. And he must marry Maggie in a few years' time if she has not found someone else to marry. And so they have this, awkward but funny scene where he's like, well, I don't know, I might become a minister. And Maggie very matter-of-factly agrees to this, and they sign a contract. They all sign a piece of paper. And so off John goes back to school, and he becomes a very successful man. He gets elected to Parliament. And Maggie marries him. He marries Maggie, although he is not particularly in love with her, and he starts to rise to heights in his career. And Maggie is subtly influencing him. She is, rewriting his speeches, tweaking them, and really driving forward his success. But then one day he comes home and announces that he wants to leave Maggie because he has fallen in love with a wealthy noblewoman. And Maggie, in her shrewd and conspiring way, sends the cheating couple off to spend a month together in the country, where John will write his final speech, as it is pretty much suspected that if he announces that he is divorcing his wife for another woman, he will quite likely be kicked from the party and lose his seat in Parliament. But Maggie proposes that if he gives a grand speech, then perhaps he can save his seat because he'll be far too valuable. But of course, Maggie has conspiring plans of her own and has plans to get John back. And I'll leave it at that. I won't spoil for you how that turns out for her. But I've quite been enjoying this collection. I've got several more to go. I'm about halfway through. Which brings me to the one that I read yesterday, Fishers of Books by Barton Curry. This is the 1931 book about books that arrived in the mail yesterday, and I don't want to say too much about this because I would like to do a series of separate videos on this book. In fact, I did one already yesterday, last night, as I was reading it, on how Trollope had fallen out of fashion and how he became popular again. So this is sort of a collection of essays about book collecting. There are some sort of whimsical ones, how the beginning urge comes on, happy-go-lucky collecting, Dickens manuscripts, how to start out with collecting. He suggests, a one-author plan, focus on one author, or you can focus on a list. And it's interesting because he's sort of against list collecting. He says, don't collect anything that you wouldn't read. Don't collect something just because it's on some list somewhere. If you can't value the book for its content, then there's really no point in having it at all. And it's quite a good book, and I'll talk more about it later. The only section I think I didn't find quite as interesting is the section on the neglected Americans. It's interesting because for quite a period of time, serious collectors didn't think that American books were worth collecting. People like Emerson and Hawthorne were seen as not as desirable as the European authors. Of course, that has vastly changed. First editions by those authors go for enormous sums of money. But that aside, I had also began reading this week Darlingissima Letters to a Friend by Janet Flanner, edited with commentary by Natalia Denesi Murray. So this is something that I believe I had picked up out of a little free library several months ago, and it was sitting on my shelf. I didn't know at all what it was about. I just knew that Janet Flanner was a journalist, well known, according to the back of this book, for writing her letters from Paris for the New Yorker in the 1920s. And then she continued to write after the close of the Second World War. And so I found out within a few letters that the letters to the friend part should have the air quotes because they were certainly more than friends. And in fact, I haven't looked it up yet, but someone on Instagram did indeed reveal to me that Janet Flanner was a lesbian, which makes a lot of sense because these letters don't read like the letters that friends write to each other. They read like the letters that lovers write to each other. And I definitely did sort of confirm it for myself when Janet was writing about being back in New York with Natalia's mother and with Natalia's son, and about them sharing a apartment and a rooftop terrace together in New York. Well, Natalia went off to Rome on assignment in 1944. And I've read up to 1951. So they both met in New York during the war, but as the war was coming to a close, they were both journalists. They were both, in radio, writing articles. Natalia ended up being sent to Rome, and Janet ended up being sent back to Paris. Janet was an American, but she had sort of made Paris her home prior to the war, and Natalia, I believe, was born in Italy. And so that's why Rome was the place that she was sent to, and she got very involved not only in journalism but with the emerging film scene at the end of at the close of the war and after the war. And so you got these very heartfelt letters, and we only have Janet's letters here, but we have extensive commentary from Natalia, and these combined give a rich picture of their relationship, but also of what immediate post-war Europe was like, and a little bit of what the intellectual and journalistic scene was like. And so I'm quite enjoying these as well. So I'm certainly going to continue on with reading that. And I'm going to continue on with the J.M. Barrie plays. And after that, I'm not entirely sure. If you've read any of these, be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. And I hope you all have a lovely Easter weekend.